Today's lesson is on the patterns of life from Chapter 1, Lesson 3. So, our desired results for this lesson are to identify characteristics of all living things. You should also be able to describe the cross cutting concepts of biology. And also, you should be able to explain how the fields of biology differ in their approaches. And lastly, you should be able to explain the importance of the metric system. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to know how to use it unless you already do, but we are going to look at why it's important and why we will be using it throughout the year. So, what does a biologist study? Well, if you know what the word biology means, bio means life, ology means to study. That means biologists must study living things, life. So the study of biology can be divided into a lot of different fields, but all of the knowledge from all of these various fields of biology lead to a few central themes, and we're going to talk about those themes today. So let's see if we can identify three ways that biology relates to your life, because oftentimes, especially at the beginning of the school year, I get questions like, Mr. Hemi, why do I have to study this? I'm never going to use this in my life. Well, here are some possible answers to ways that biology could relate to your life. For one, your own bodies are life. So it's good to know how your body works. It's good to know how your body processes the foods that you eat because we all have choices in foods that we eat. We can eat fast food all the time, or we can eat salads and healthy proteins all the time. And those choices are going to have an impact as to how your body reacts and how well you're going to feel. And a third way that it relates is that the ecosystems that we depend on for things like water and other resources are obviously critically important to our survival. So biology studies these things, and so it's good to know. All right, well, let's get into some of the characteristics of living things. Characteristics of life, basically, we can organize those into a list of 8 different characteristics. So the first 3 terms are already on the board. First, they're made up of cells. In other words, all living things are made of cells, and a lot of organisms might only consist of one single cell, but they do consist of a cell. Other organisms, of course, like us, we consist of trillions of cells, and those cells kind of all work together. Now, the second characteristic is reproduction. So, living things are able to reproduce. And there are 2 methods that reproduction takes place in. One is sexual reproduction, which would require a male and a female. And then there's asexual reproduction, which is where a single organism reproduces on its own. The third characteristic is the genetic code. All living things are based on a universal genetic language, and this language is in the form of a molecular code. We know it as DNA. So here are some other characteristics. All living things grow and develop, and all living things are also able to respond to their environment. External factors like changes in light or temperature will stimulate a response in living things. Another characteristic is that living things must maintain a stable internal environment. So we use the term homeostasis to describe the state of stable maintenance by an organism. An example of homeostasis in a person could be maintaining a stable internal temperature. If you swim in ice water in the middle of winter, here in Pennsylvania, the water will get pretty cold. You will go into hypothermia and you can eventually die because your internal body temperature goes too low and your organs can't survive that. They'll shut down and that'll be the end. The last characteristic is that living things change over time, and we call that evolution or just change over time. All right, now, as I mentioned in our desired results, we're going to learn about the cross-cutting concepts in biology, and there are 7 of these cross-cutting concepts. You could also call them central themes. So think of them as kind of themes that run throughout all of the things that we study in biology. Now, it's important to understand these cross-cutting concepts because it will allow you to relate the specific information to kind of a larger, more general concept. So this is kind of the top-down view where you're way up high and you can see all of the field or whatever you have in your view. In this case, biology. All right, so you might want to take some notes here because you're going to be asked about these concepts. So let's get into the first one, and that is, well, here's the first 5, but the first one is cause and effect. So it's mechanism and explanation. The second one is systems and system models. These kind of are seen throughout biology. Stability and change. Seems like they're opposites, but they're really not. Stability leads to change. That's kind of predictable in a lot of ways, sometimes not. But that is one of the other cross-cutting concepts in biology. And we also have patterns, and we also have scale, proportion, and quantity. Now, patterns is an interesting one because you can look at things. In fact, our art teacher recently took a picture of a sunflower. Absolutely gorgeous picture. She's a great photographer. Yeah, the sunflower showed this spiral pattern in the way that the seeds in the center were arranged. You could see the spiral pattern in it. Very cool, very cool. So patterns exist in nature, and we can find them everywhere. Scale, proportion, and quantity are also everywhere. So the larger a living thing is, the more capability it has in terms of being strong and things like that. The other two are energy and matter. And energy and matter have these flows or cycles. There's also the laws of conservation that kind of govern how energy and matter exist. Okay, that's the sixth one. And then the seventh idea is this idea of structure and function. So you'll hear me talk a lot about structure and function throughout the year because the structure of something that we're looking at will often determine its function. Okay. For example, muscle cells are designed specifically to allow you movement. Okay. Because they have the ability to elongate and shorten. Okay. Heart cells are similar to muscle cells, but they are a little bit different, and they are able to contract and then release as well. Nervous tissue or nerve cells have the ability to transmit signals, and that's based on their design, how they're structured. Okay, so those are all things that we will be looking at throughout this course. Now, biology can be studied in a lot of different settings, and each of those settings would basically require kind of a focus on specific uh, areas within biology. So, we're going to talk about a few examples of biologists, and again, these are just a few, but maybe some of these might interest you in terms of a future career. The first one is global ecology. Now, global ecology is something you might want to consider a career in. You can see we have some scientists out here in the field. They're creating some kind of apparatus. I'm not sure what that apparatus is, but they would be looking at ecology, which is the interaction of the environment and all of the living things within it, how all of those things interact with each other on a global scale. Another field of biology would be biotechnology, and that's where we learn how living things work in an effort to basically improve the standard of living for human beings. So you can see a scientist here in the lab looking at a petri dish where maybe he's studying molds or bacterias, and maybe he's trying to learn how to combat them so that we don't get sick from them. Entomology, of course, is the study of insects. And there are a number of insects that can make us very sick. Mosquitoes, for example, carry malaria, which has been pretty much eradicated, although it does still occur in places like Africa and places where it's hard to get the medicines in that prevent that. But entomologists would study insects and how they transmit disease, and then they would work with biotechnologists to try to combat that. Another one is molecular biology, and that is where we study the biology of molecules. How do molecules interact with one another? Now, there are certainly other fields as well. Some of these fields of biology that we just talked about, such as molecular biology and genomics, which is the study of the gene or DNA, these didn't exist until pretty recently. So there's a lot of areas within there that still need research. So you could get involved in that if you're interested in a science career. And of course, the development of those fields of biology were largely pushed and made possible by new technologies. Now, there are other fields of biology that we didn't talk about here, like paleontology, that have existed for years and years and years. But new technology has also improved their ability to understand what has happened in the past. Paleontology is the study of living things from the past, basically like dinosaurs. All right, so what are some ways that scientists in the fields of biology described on these pages use technology? Well, some answers might be, well, molecular biologists use computers to analyze DNA sequences, whereas global ecologists will use satellites to gather data. And I just saw an advertisement in the last couple weeks from NASA, and they're planning on launching a fleet of satellites that are basically going to do exactly that. They're going to gather data around the world all at the same time in an effort to help us try to understand better how climate works.
For more than 50 years, NASA has been collecting and providing data on Earth's land, water, ice, and atmosphere. Now, a new era of Earth science has begun. Together with international partners, NASA will launch the SWOT mission to provide the first ever global survey of Earth's surface water, the oceans, lakes, and rivers that affect all of us. But we also need to understand our planet as a complex whole. That's why NASA will launch a fleet of state-of-the-art satellites forming the Earth System Observatory, which will create a comprehensive 4D view of Earth, from bedrock to atmosphere like never before. The Earth System Observatory will arm us with crucial data to help us address climate change and protect our communities. But how do we get this critical information to the people who need it? Introducing the Earth Information Center. NASA, working with our federal partners, will equip decision makers with the information they need to mitigate, adapt, and respond to climate change. We will create a greenhouse gas monitoring system and make data about our changing planet accessible to those who need it most. New satellites observing in the sky, and an information center here on Earth, protecting our planet for the next generation.
It is a worthy field of study, and we really just don't understand how climate works well enough. There's influences that we just don't understand, such as how the sun and sunspots and flares and all of solar flares and all of those things, how they impact climate. We do know historically that climate gets warmer and colder, so it goes through fluctuations. So is the climate change that we're experiencing now just a function of how global climate works over long term? We don't have enough data that we haven't collected data for long enough to really be able to see the pattern of global climate change. No doubt the climate is changing. Is it 100% because humans use fossil fuels? I personally am not convinced. You may feel otherwise, and that's fine. You can definitely have an opinion that differs from mine, and maybe you have some research that you can share with me that will convince me of your position, and that's perfectly welcomed, as a matter of fact. So it's good to consider how the fields of biology, the ones that we described here, and even other ones, are, they're all interconnected. In other words, how could a wildlife biologist use information generated from a molecular biologist? Well, if you think about it, a wildlife biologist could use the molecular biologist's information to find out if two species that appear to be similar are actually genetically related. All right, so there's a bunch of careers available in the fields of biology. So if you do have an interest in science, if you like science, if it's one of your favorite courses that you like to take when you're in school, you might want to consider one of these courses, one of these fields of science as a potential career for you. And there's lots of other scientific fields that you could get into as well. So talk to your guidance counselor if you're interested. I'm sure that they can give you much more information. All right, now lastly, we wanted to talk about the importance of accurate measurement in science. So, how important do you think that it is that we're able to measure accurately? Well, in science, it is extremely important. Even the very slightest errors in measurement can decrease the ability for scientific information to be accurate and reliable. So, by using the metric system, this often involves conversions between metric units. And the great thing about the metric system is that it's all factors of 10. You can see here with length, 1 meter is equal to 100 centimeters. So a meter is 100 times longer than a centimeter. A meter is 1,000 millimeters. So it's 1,000 times longer than millimeters. So millimeters are smaller than centimeters. And if you have 1,000 meters, then you have a kilometer. So kilometers are longer than meters, 1,000 times longer. Volume goes the same way. So if you're trying to measure liquids or the amount of space within a specific area, we would measure that with liters. And 1 liter, like 1 meter, is 1,000 milliliters, just like 1,000 millimeters. So if you learn it for one, if you learn the metric system for length, you already know the metric system for volume, mass, and temperature. Although temperature is a little different. I wouldn't say temperature. If you learn how to read the metric, if you learn how to use the metric system for length, you can just apply the same principles to volume and mass. You just change the ending part of the word. So it's still centimeters or centigrams, millimeters or milligrams, kilometers or kiloliters or kilograms. Okay, it's all the same. Now with temperature, it is a little different because the metric unit for temperature is called Celsius or centigrade. The reason centigrade is better than Fahrenheit, which is what you guys are all familiar with, is because it starts at 0. So the freezing point of water is at 0 Celsius. Now in Fahrenheit, it's 32. That's just an odd number. It's hard to multiply 32. If the water's twice as hot, well, that's a pretty easy one. 32 plus 32 is 64. But if I tell you that the water is 5 times hotter than the freezing point, figuring out 32 times 5 is much more difficult. Now, if you're a math whiz, maybe that's not so hard for you. But imagine starting from 0. What's 100 times hotter than 0? 100. What's 5 times hotter than 0? 500. So easy to use. But it is a shift in thinking because we're so used to Fahrenheit. We're also used to the empirical system. So we use inches, feet, yards. That's empirical. And they're all very arbitrary measurements. So how many inches is in a foot? 12. How many feet are in a yard? 3. It's just completely arbitrary and it makes no sense. So scaling up is much more difficult. Who can tell me how many feet are in a mile? It's just weird. But if you're talking kilometers, I can tell you how many meters are in a kilometer much more easily. 1,000. So in Europe, they use a lot more metric. In fact, they use kilometers. So instead of miles per hour, they use kilometers per hour. Next time you're in your parents' car, take a look at the speedometer. You'll see the miles per hour, all the numbers around the circle, unless you have a digital speedometer, then you won't see this. But even with a digital, you can change it to kilometers to give you kilometers per hour. But it's very hard to change between empirical and metric. So the metric system is all based on units of 10, which makes it very easy to use. So here are some examples of conversions. So if we have 0.45 liters, how many millimeters would that be? Well, multiply it by, let's see, if we're going from liters to milliliters, we multiply it by 1,000. So that means we move the decimal point the same number of zeros that we're multiplying by. So that would give us 450 milliliters. Okay. Now, what if we had 1 kilometer? How many millimeters would be in there? That would be 1,000. So we're moving the decimal point, which would be 1.0. We're going to multiply by 1,000 because kilometers are 1,000 meters. Of course, it's right here, so we can just look there and it tells us. But yeah, we'd move because we're multiplying by 1,000, we'd move the decimal place three spots. Okay, how about 5,000 milligrams? Well, we would divide by 1,000, right? If we're going from milligrams to grams, we divide by 1,000, so we'd move the decimal point 1, 2, 3 places. Okay, 1, 2, 3. So that would be 5 grams. How about 0.17 grams into milligrams? Here we would be multiplying by 1,000. So we're going to move the decimal place 3 spots because there's 3 zeros in 1,000. That would give us 17 milligrams. How about 130 meters? Well, it's 130.0. We divide because we're going from small to large. So we'd move the decimal place 3 spots this way. That would give us 0.13 or 0.13 kilometers. And if we were trying to convert 2,500 milliliters into liters, we'd move the decimal point 3 places. So that would give us 2.5. So as you can see, maybe you're not exact, maybe that's a little confusing to you, but I think you can also see that it's very easy to do these conversions once you understand, basically which way to move the decimal place. All right, well, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.